In December 1945, a farmer in Egypt discovered 13 codices that had been buried for about 1,600 years. Among those manuscripts, according to this narrative, were teachings that had been the target of centuries of rejection by the institutional church. The central idea presented in these texts is that Jesus did not speak only about love, compassion, and forgiveness, but also about a path of direct knowledge, a way of perceiving hidden dimensions of reality. Before treating this as mere mysticism, proponents of this view point to the documents discovered near Nag Hammadi. Among them are the so-called Gospel of Thomas, the Apocryphal Gospel of John, and the Pistis Sophia. These writings, composed in Coptic and derived from earlier Greek traditions, were studied and translated by scholars throughout the 20th century. The edition organized by James M. Robinson, published by HarperCollins in 1990, made this material widely accessible to the public. In these texts, descriptions of the so-called Archons appear, a term derived from the Greek archon, meaning ruler or authority. Within Gnostic cosmology, they are presented as intermediary forces associated with the material world and spiritual ignorance. Instead of psychological metaphors, the texts portray them as agents who keep humanity away from its divine origin through a veil of forgetfulness. According to this tradition, the central problem is not moral, but of consciousness. The word gnosis means direct knowledge, not belief, but inner experience. The emphasis is on personal perception of the truth, without the need for institutional mediation. It is precisely this emphasis on direct experience that generated tension with hierarchical religious structures throughout history. Some modern scholars have noted symbolic parallels between these ancient descriptions and concepts from depth psychology. Carl Jung, for example, spoke of archetypes and autonomous contents of the collective unconscious, psychic patterns that seem to act with relative independence within the human mind. Although Jung did not affirm the literal existence of spiritual entities, he recognized that certain psychic contents manifest with surprising force and autonomy. Historically, in 325 AD, Emperor Constantine convened the Council of Nicaea, which helped define doctrinal guidelines for nascent Christianity. Over time, only 4 Gospels were incorporated into the official canon. Other writings, including Gnostic texts, came to be considered heretical. Later, under Theodosius I, Nicene Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, and divergent currents were suppressed. Centuries later, in 1945, the discovery of the Nag Hammadi manuscripts rekindled academic interest in these traditions. Researcher Elaine Pagels published in 1979 The Gnostic Gospels, a work that popularized the debate on the diversity of early Christianity and raised questions about authority, revelation, and spiritual experience. In Gnostic texts, spiritual liberation is described as a process of inner awakening. This idea does not arise as mere opposition to external religious practices, but as an invitation to a deeply personal journey. Instead of relying exclusively on rituals, institutional structures, or repeated formulas, the practitioner is called to turn inward, examine their own consciousness, and recognize hidden dimensions of their being. The emphasis is not only on believing in something outside oneself, but on perceiving a truth that, according to this perspective, already rests within the individual. Gnosticism, as a spiritual movement present in the early centuries of the Christian era, developed a particular view of knowledge, the so-called gnosis. This knowledge is not merely intellectual, it is a transformative perception, an inner illumination capable of liberating the soul from ignorance. For many Gnostic texts, the central problem of humanity is not simply sin understood morally, but ignorance of one's own spiritual origin. Thus, salvation is presented as awakening, as remembrance of one's true identity. Within this tradition, the mind occupies a fundamental role. Observing one's own thoughts, discerning inner impulses, and cultivating awareness become essential practices. The practitioner is encouraged to perceive how illusions, fears, and conditioning shape their perception of reality. By recognizing these internal veils, a process of liberation begins. Transformation does not occur merely through external adherence to doctrine, but through a change in perception. Some passages from the Gospel of Thomas emphasize that what is hidden within the human being, when brought to light, becomes a source of salvation. This idea is expressed in sayings attributed to Jesus, in which the kingdom is described as something that does not come visibly or externally, but as a reality already present, though unrecognized. The language is symbolic, inviting interpretation and introspection. It is not a linear narrative like the canonical Gospels, but a collection of brief and enigmatic teachings that challenge the reader to reflect deeply. This perspective shifts the focus of spiritual transformation to the interior of the individual. Light is not something to be sought only outside, but discovered within. Darkness is not merely an external circumstance, but a state of unconsciousness. Thus, Gnostic awakening can be understood as a process of spiritual self-knowledge. Knowing oneself becomes at the same time a path to knowing the divine. It is important to recognize that these texts emerged in a specific historical context, marked by intense theological diversity in the first centuries of Christianity. Different communities interpreted Jesus' teachings in various ways. While some emphasized apostolic authority and communal structure, others explored more mystical and symbolic dimensions of faith. Gnosticism was one of these currents, offering a reading that valued inner revelation. When analyzing these traditions, it becomes clear that the emphasis on inner awakening resonates with a universal human quest, the search for meaning. At many moments in life, external rituals may seem insufficient if not accompanied by internal transformation. The Gnostic proposal echoes precisely this concern. It suggests that no external practice produces true liberation if the inner self remains obscured. However, balance is necessary when approaching these texts. The inner awakening described in Gnosticism does not eliminate the ethical dimension. On the contrary, expanded consciousness should result in changed behavior. One who awakens becomes more attentive, more compassionate, less dominated by unconscious impulses. Liberation is not escape from the world, but a new way of inhabiting it. The symbolic language of the Gospel of Thomas reinforces this dimension. When it speaks of bringing to light what is inside, the text points to a spiritual truth that needs recognition. Light, in this context, represents awareness. That which remains hidden, fears, ignorance, illusions, keeps the individual captive. When illuminated, it loses its power. This principle finds echoes in various spiritual traditions, which associate self-knowledge with freedom. At the same time, the notion that the kingdom is within the human being provokes profound theological reflection. It invites reconsideration of the relationship between transcendence and interiority. The divine is not presented only as a distant reality, but as an intimate presence. This emphasis does not deny God's transcendence, but highlights the possibility of direct experience. For the contemporary seeker, this focus can be particularly significant. We live in an age marked by excess information and paradoxically by scarcity of inner silence. The call to inner awakening demands pause. It requires contemplation. It demands courage to look inward without masks. Often, it is easier to participate in external practices than to confront inner conflicts. Gnosticism, by valuing awareness, calls the individual to responsibility for their own transformation. Yet, this journey should not be confused with spiritual isolation. Even in Gnostic traditions, there were communities, masters, and disciples. Inner awakening occurred within a context of teaching and transmission. This reminds us that self-knowledge need not be solitary. It can be accompanied by dialogue, study, and sharing. Another relevant aspect is the relationship between knowledge and salvation. In Gnostic texts, to know is to liberate oneself. But this knowledge is not mere accumulation of data. It is existential perception. It is as if the individual awakens from a state of spiritual sleep. This metaphor of awakening is powerful, suggesting that reality has always been present but was not fully perceived. Reflecting on these ideas, it becomes evident that spiritual liberation described in Gnostic texts involves profound transformation of consciousness. It begins with observation of one's own thoughts, passes through discernment of one's own motivations, and culminates in a new way of perceiving oneself and the world. It is not an instantaneous event, but a gradual process. For those approaching these writings with an open mind and critical spirit, there are valuable lessons to consider. The importance of interiority, the need for awareness, and the recognition that true transformation begins within are themes that remain relevant. At the same time, it is essential to situate these ideas in their historical and theological context, avoiding simplistic readings. Ultimately, the Gnostic description of spiritual liberation as inner awakening invites a fundamental question: how aware are we of ourselves? To what extent are our beliefs lived with deep understanding and not merely repeated out of habit? Awakening does not require automatic rejection of external traditions, but integration of exterior and interior. Thus, Gnostic texts offer a perspective that significantly broadens the horizon of early Christian reflection. They remind us that in the first centuries, Christianity did not develop as a homogeneous and uniform block, but as a dynamic field of spiritual experiences, interpretations, and quests for the ultimate meaning of existence. Within this plural context, Gnostic literature occupies a unique place, as it shifts the axis of faith from exclusively institutional centrality to an emphasis on inner transformation of the human being. Much of this writing came to light in the 20th century, especially after the discovery of the Nag Hammadi Library in Egypt in 1945. This finding revealed to the world a collection of texts previously known only through critiques by Christian authors considered orthodox. Among these documents are works such as the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, and the Gospel of Truth. These writings should not be read as mere competitors of the canonical Gospels, but as testimonies of spiritual currents seeking to understand the meaning of Jesus' message from another perspective. In Gnostic texts, salvation is often described as awakening. The term gnosis means knowledge, but it is not merely intellectual knowledge. It is a transformative experience, an awareness of the divine origin of the soul and its condition of forgetfulness within the material world. For many of these writings, the material reality is seen as imperfect or even the result of a cosmic fall. Thus, the human drama consists of living alienated from one's own spiritual essence. This approach shifts the center of faith to the interior of the individual. Transformation does not occur primarily through adherence to a visible structure, but through recognition of a deep truth already residing in the human being. The emphasis is less on external authority than on internal illumination. This does not imply the absence of community, but suggests that true liberation begins when a person discovers within themselves the forgotten divine spark. Such a perspective broadens the horizon of early Christian reflection by demonstrating that, from the beginning, there were intense questions about identity, suffering, and human destiny. Who are we? Where did we come from? Where are we going? Gnostic texts answer by affirming that humans have a transcendent origin, and that ignorance of this origin is the root of alienation. Salvation, therefore, is described as restored memory. It is important to recognize that this view came into tension with Christian leaders who emphasized the goodness of creation and the real incarnation of Christ. For many theologians who shaped later tradition, the idea that the material world was essentially negative threatened the understanding of the incarnation and resurrection. Still, even amid disagreements, Gnostic literature remains a testimony to the intellectual and spiritual vitality of early Christianity. By affirming that what is hidden within the human being can become a source of salvation when brought to light, these texts point to a truth that resonates beyond their historical context. Change begins internally. Before any external reform, transformation of consciousness is necessary. This idea finds echoes in various spiritual and philosophical traditions, but in Gnostic texts it assumes a particularly intense form, as it is linked to a cosmic narrative of fall and return. The symbolism present in these writings is profound and often poetic. Light represents the knowledge that dispels the darkness of ignorance. Sleep symbolizes the alienated human condition, while awakening indicates the beginning of liberation. These images are not merely literary. They express a concrete spiritual experience for those who identified with this current of thought. Furthermore, Gnostic texts challenge the notion that faith is limited to the passive acceptance of doctrinal formulas. They suggest that truth must be experienced, not merely affirmed. This emphasis on inner experience contributes to broadening our understanding of ancient Christian diversity. It shows that the search for God involved both theological reflection and mystical exploration. However, it is necessary to avoid simplifications. Not all writings classified as Gnostic share the same ideas. and the term Gnosticism itself is a modern construct used to group diverse movements. Still, there is a common thread, the conviction that the human being carries within themselves something that needs to be awakened. This perspective confers spiritual dignity to the individual and proposes a journey of self-knowledge as a path to redemption. From a historical point of view, the study of these texts allows for a re-evaluation of the formation of the canon and the boundaries of orthodoxy. By observing the contrast between accepted and rejected writings, we realize that the definition of Christianity involved choices, debates, and discernments over time. Gnostic texts do not simply represent defeated heresies, but voices that participated in the complex dialogue that shaped Christian identity. Theologically, they raise thought-provoking questions. If salvation involves inner knowledge, what is the role of the community? If truth is hidden in the human heart, how does it relate to historical revelation? These questions do not lose relevance. They continue to provoke reflection on the relationship between personal experience and shared tradition. On an existential level, the Gnostic message touches a deep human longing, the desire for meaning. The idea that there is something within us that transcends the apparent limitations of material reality offers hope. Even if one does not fully adopt Gnostic cosmology, the emphasis on inner transformation remains significant. Lasting changes, both personal and collective, begin with awareness, recognition of limitations, and openness to truth. Thus, by broadening the horizon of early Christian reflection, Gnostic texts invite us to see Christianity as a multifaceted movement. They remind us that faith is not only adherence to visible structures, institutions, or formal declarations. It is also an internal process, a journey of self-discovery and progressive illumination. Spiritual experience is not reduced to externality. It involves inner depth. By emphasizing that what is hidden can become a source of salvation when revealed, these writings point to a universal dynamic: light dispelling darkness, awareness overcoming ignorance, awakening breaking the sleep of alienation. Regardless of the historical disputes surrounding them, their contribution remains as an invitation to reflection. Ultimately, the assertion that change begins within resonates beyond the boundaries of Gnosticism. It engages with the intuition that no authentic transformation occurs without renewal of mind and heart. By bringing to light what was hidden, the human being begins a process of reconciliation with themselves and, by extension, with the transcendent. Therefore, Gnostic texts should not be seen merely as historical curiosities. They are testimonies of an intense quest for meaning and an understanding of faith that values awakened consciousness. By recognizing them as part of the mosaic of early Christianity, we expand our perception of the richness and complexity of the path traversed in the first centuries. And by reflecting on their emphasis on inner transformation, we are reminded that any genuine spiritual journey inevitably begins within us. This invitation to awakening remains current. It calls the seeker to examine their own mind, discern thoughts, cultivate awareness, and allow the light of understanding to dissipate the shadows of ignorance. More than theory, it is experience. More than concept, it is a journey. And on this journey, liberation is not something distant, but a process that begins the moment someone decides to look inward with sincerity and courage. Practices attributed to these traditions include attentive observation of thoughts, differentiating between internal states of peace and disturbance, and cultivating a stance of inner witnessing. In contemporary terms, this resembles exercises in mindfulness and self-reflection. The aim is not to foster fear, but to enhance clarity. Another recurring image in these texts is the idea of unifying opposites, inner and outer, high and low, masculine and feminine, as a symbol of psychic and spiritual integration. Throughout history, thinkers like René Descartes reflected on the relationship between mind and body, speculating on the role of the pineal gland as a symbolic interface point between dimensions of experience. Regardless of literal or symbolic interpretations, the central point of these writings is the sovereignty of consciousness. They suggest that the human being can develop discernment, recognize internal patterns that limit them, and reclaim responsibility over their own perception. The rediscovery of the Nag Hammadi texts significantly expanded academic understanding of early Christianity, revealing a far more diverse and complex scenario than had been imagined for centuries. For a long time, the predominant narrative about Christian origins was constructed mainly from texts that came to compose the New Testament and the writings of the so-called Church Fathers. These documents, undoubtedly fundamental, shaped the theological and historical understanding of the development of Christian faith. However, the discovery of an entire library of ancient texts in the interior of Egypt in the mid-20th century opened a new window into the past. The manuscripts known as Nag Hammadi were found in 1945 near the Egyptian city of the same name. Buried in ceramic jars, these codices contained a collection of writings in the Coptic language, many associated with Gnostic currents of early Christianity. Among these texts were Gospels, theological treatises, dialogues attributed to apostles, and mystical reflections presenting distinct interpretations of the figure of Jesus, the creation of the world, the nature of salvation, and the destiny of the soul. This discovery had a profound impact on the field of Christian history. Until then, much of what was known about Gnosticism came mainly from critiques by Christian leaders who considered it heretical. In other words, the movement was known primarily through its opponents. With the Nag Hammadi texts, it became possible to hear the direct voice of these communities. This did not mean automatically validating their perspectives, but it allowed for a fairer and more contextualized understanding. Among the writings found was the already mentioned Gospel of Thomas, a collection of sayings attributed to Jesus, some parallel to the canonical Gospels and others with very distinct characteristics. The existence of this text raised important questions about the diversity of oral and written traditions in the early centuries. It became evident that different communities preserved and transmitted teachings in varied ways, emphasizing different aspects of the Christian message. From this material, it became clearer that early Christianity was not a homogeneous block. Multiple interpretations circulated simultaneously. Some communities emphasized apostolic authority and institutional succession. Others valued mystical experiences and inner revelations. Some understood salvation in terms of historical and bodily redemption, others as spiritual liberation through inner knowledge. This diversity should not be seen as a sign of chaos, but as a reflection of a period of intense search for understanding and identity. The rediscovery of these texts also prompted methodological revisions in academic research. Historians began working with a broader set of sources, reconsidering simplified narratives about orthodoxy and heresy. Instead of imagining that a single form of Christianity existed from the beginning and that all others were later deviations, many scholars recognized that different currents coexisted in the early centuries, competing for space, influence, and legitimacy. This does not mean that all interpretations held the same historical weight or were equally influential. Over time, certain currents became predominant, especially those associated with major episcopal sees and councils that defined central doctrines. However, the fact that other voices existed and left written records expands our understanding of the process by which Christianity was structured. In the first centuries, Christianity was not a centralized institution with rigidly established theological boundaries. It was an expanding movement, spread across different regions of the Roman Empire and beyond. Communities emerged in varied cultural contexts, in Palestine, Syria, Asia Minor, Egypt, Rome, and each faced specific challenges. How they understood the person of Jesus, the nature of salvation, and the relationship between law and grace could vary according to their historical and social environment. Over time, especially from the 2nd century onward, efforts to establish criteria for unity intensified. Lists of books considered authoritative, clearer doctrinal definitions, and more organized episcopal structures emerged. Major centers such as Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch began to exert significant influence. The need to preserve cohesion in the face of external persecutions and internal divergences drove the consolidation of an orthodoxy recognized across wide regions. Councils played a fundamental role in this process of doctrinal consolidation and ecclesiastical organization. They were not merely administrative meetings, but decisive moments in the history of Christianity, in which leaders from different regions gathered to address theological issues that threatened the unity of the faith. The Council of Nicaea, for example, convened in the 4th century, sought to respond to intense debates about the nature of Christ, debates that had already been spreading across various Christian communities of the Roman Empire. The controversy that prompted Nicaea was deeply linked to the teachings of Arius, a presbyter of Alexandria, who argued that the Son had been created by the Father and therefore was not eternal in the same way as God the Father. This position provoked strong reactions from other Christian leaders who saw it as a threat to the traditional understanding of Christ's divinity. The conflict was not merely theoretical, it divided churches, bishops, and entire communities. The tension became so significant that Emperor Constantine decided to intervene, convening the council with the goal of preserving religious unity and, consequently, the stability of the empire. The formulation of the Nicene Creed was not an isolated act, nor a simple authoritarian imposition. It was the result of deep discussions, detailed arguments, and at times heated debates that reflected the intensity of the convictions involved. At the heart of this process was the Council of Nicaea, held in the year 325, a decisive moment in the consolidation of Christian theology. It was not merely a matter of resolving an intellectual dispute, but of protecting what many leaders considered essential for the identity of the Christian faith. Bishops from different regions of the Roman Empire attended the council, bringing with them local traditions, pastoral experiences, and theological interpretations shaped by their own cultural contexts. There were representatives from East and West, communities that spoke different languages, and had developed distinct emphases in explaining the mystery of Christ. This diversity made the debates even more complex, as each position had to be analyzed not only in philosophical terms, but also in relation to practical implications for the life of the churches. The main controversy revolved around the relationship between the Father and the Son. Presbyter Arius argued that the Son, though exalted, had been created by the Father, and therefore did not share the same divine eternity. His opponents saw this position as a direct threat to the understanding of salvation. If Christ were not fully divine, how could he offer complete redemption? The discussion was not merely speculative, it touched the core of the Christian message. In this context, the term homoousios became central to the conciliar definition. This Greek word, meaning of the same substance, was chosen to affirm that the Son was not a highly exalted creature, but fully shared in the divine essence of the Father. The adoption of this term was strategic and theologically calculated. It did not appear explicitly in Scripture, but it was considered necessary to express precisely what many bishops understood to be implicit in the apostolic tradition. The terminological choice was not accidental. It was carefully crafted to exclude interpretations deemed inadequate and to preserve what the participants understood as the core of the received faith. By affirming that the Son is consubstantial with the Father, the Creed established a clear boundary against any attempt to reduce Christ to an inferior position within the divinity. At the same time, it sought to maintain the personal distinction between Father and Son, avoiding confusion of identities. This theological balance demonstrates the sophistication of the debate. The bishops were not simply reacting emotionally, they were engaged in deep reflection, dialoguing with philosophical categories available at the time and attempting to formulate language faithful to Scripture and the liturgical experience of the Church. Christian faith already included practices of worshipping Christ and confessing his divinity. The challenge was to articulate these convictions systematically and coherently. Beyond the theological aspect, there was also a pastoral dimension. The division caused by the Arian controversy was generating instability in communities. Churches were fragmenting, leaders accused each other, and the faithful were confused by contradictory teachings. The Nicene Creed sought to provide clarity. It was not merely an abstract formula, but an instrument of unity and guidance for communal life. It is important to recognize that Emperor Constantine's support also decisively influenced the environment of the Council of Nicaea. After the promulgation of the Edict of Milan, which granted religious freedom to Christians and ended systematic persecutions, the political and religious landscape of the Roman Empire underwent profound transformation. Christianity, previously marginalized and often persecuted, became progressively integrated into imperial structures. In this new context, the unity of the Church ceased to be solely an internal matter of faith and came to have direct implications for the stability of the empire itself. Constantine understood that intense theological divergences could generate dangerous social divisions. The Arian controversy, spreading rapidly across the eastern provinces, was not a debate confined to academic circles. It mobilized entire communities, provoked public disputes, and threatened the religious cohesion that the emperor sought to consolidate. For a ruler who saw religion as a factor of political unity, doctrinal fragmentation represented a concrete risk to imperial order. Although he did not dictate theological definitions directly, Constantine's presence at the council exerted symbolic and practical influence. He convened the bishops, financed their travel, and presided over the opening sessions. His figure represented supreme authority in the political sphere, and this inevitably shaped the atmosphere of the discussions. While theological decisions were formulated by ecclesiastical leaders, the institutional framework of the council occurred under imperial sponsorship. It is necessary, however, to avoid simplifications. Constantine was not a theologian and did not possess technical training to intervene in the details of Christological disputes. His main concern was religious peace. For him, the controversy between Arius's supporters and their opponents threatened the harmony of the newly unified empire under his leadership. Thus, the search for consensus was not merely a spiritual ideal, but also a political strategy. This intertwining of faith and power inaugurated a new stage in Christian history. Until then, the Church had lived on the margins of official structures, often in tension with the state. From the 4th century onward, this relationship changed radically. Christianity ceased to be a persecuted religion to become a favored and later dominant religion. The internal dynamics of the Church began to engage more directly with imperial interests. The Council, therefore, cannot be understood merely as a purely theological event. It was also a political occurrence of great relevance. The very idea of gathering bishops from different regions to deliberate on doctrinal issues gained strength within this new imperial context. Conciliar authority, although based on apostolic tradition, came to have the backing of civil power. This change had profound consequences. On the one hand, it allowed for greater organization and doctrinal uniformity. State support facilitated the circulation of conciliar decisions and reinforced their implementation across the provinces. On the other hand, it opened space for future tensions. The closeness between church and state would raise, over the centuries, debates about spiritual autonomy, religious coercion, and the use of political power to impose definitions of faith. Constantine himself saw himself as a providential instrument to promote Christian unity. His conversion, associated with the famous vision before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, was interpreted by many as a sign of divine intervention in history. By favoring Christianity, he believed he was strengthening the empire under the protection of the Christian God. This perception reinforced the idea that political stability and religious unity were interconnected. In the council environment, imperial authority created a sense of urgency. The bishops knew that prolonged division could compromise not only ecclesial life, but also social order. Thus, the search for clear doctrinal formulas, such as the affirmation that the Son is of the same substance as the Father, was embedded in a broader context of pacification and institutional consolidation. However, the attempt to resolve controversies did not immediately eliminate conflicts. Even after the council, the Arian debate continued for decades, with periods of imperial support for different theological currents. This demonstrates that the emperor's influence did not mean absolute control over theological dynamics. The relationship between church and state was complex, marked by cooperation, but also by tensions and constant reconfigurations. In the long term, the model inaugurated during this period profoundly shaped the development of Christianity. The convening of ecumenical councils under imperial sponsorship became a recurring practice in subsequent centuries. Doctrinal definitions came to receive official recognition, and orthodoxy gained clearer contours within the political structure of the empire. This process also influenced the very understanding of authority within the church. The figure of the bishop acquired greater public relevance, and conciliar decisions came to be seen as a collegial expression of universal Christian leadership. The dialogue between theological tradition and political power became a defining feature of ancient Christendom. At the same time, questions arose regarding the limits of this alliance. If the emperor could convene councils, where was the boundary between legitimate influence and undue interference? How could the spiritual integrity of the faith be preserved in the face of political convenience? These questions traversed medieval history and remain relevant in contemporary debates on secularism and religious freedom. Thus, recognizing Constantine's role does not mean reducing the council to a political instrument, but understanding its concrete historical insertion. 4th century Christianity was no longer a marginal movement. It had become a significant social force. Interaction with imperial power was a consequence of this growth, and at the same time, a factor that accelerated its institutionalization. The relationship between church and state, initiated during this period of rapprochement, profoundly marked the subsequent development of Christianity. It influenced administrative structures, doctrinal definitions, and even missionary expansion. The Christian faith began to shape laws, customs, and concepts of authority across various regions of the former empire. However, this proximity also demanded ongoing discernment. History showed that the union between spiritual power and political power could generate both stability and conflict. The legacy of the 4th century is ambivalent. On one hand, it consolidated doctrinal unity. On the other, it inaugurated enduring debates on coercion, freedom, and legitimacy. In summary, Constantine's support of the council created favorable conditions for theological deliberation on an unprecedented scale. His pursuit of religious stability was linked to the project of imperial unification. Although he did not directly define dogmatic formulas, his authority shaped the environment in which they were formulated. From that moment on, the history of Christianity could no longer be completely separated from the political history of the empire. Understanding this interaction helps to see that the formation of Christian doctrine occurred in a real context, marked by interests, tensions, and strategies. Faith did not develop in a vacuum, but within concrete social structures, and the relationship between church and state initiated under Constantine became one of the most determining factors for the course of Christian tradition over the centuries. Even after the promulgation of the Creed, controversies did not cease immediately. The term homoousios continued to be debated, reinterpreted, and at times contested. There were decades of tension before the Nicene position was broadly consolidated. This demonstrates that doctrinal formulation is a historical process, not an instantaneous event. The authority of a council needed to be received, taught, and incorporated by communities over time. The impact of the Nicene Creed went beyond its immediate context. It became the basis for subsequent confessions and a reference for later Christological debates. Councils such as Constantinople and Chalcedon deepened and clarified aspects of Trinitarian and Christological doctrine, but always in dialogue with the foundation established at Nicaea. Thus, the choice of the term homoousios was not merely a temporary solution, it became a lasting theological landmark. Reflecting on this process helps to understand that the Christian tradition did not develop simplistically. There was an intense search for fidelity to apostolic teaching, but this fidelity needed to be expressed in language comprehensible to each generation. The use of Greek philosophical categories did not represent an abandonment of biblical faith, but an attempt to translate it into terms capable of confronting the intellectual challenges of the time. The formulation of the Creed also reveals the importance of communal discernment. No bishop alone determined the final content. It was the result of interaction, confrontation, and collective deliberation. This communal aspect reinforces the idea that Christian faith has always been lived in fellowship, not merely as an individual experience. When considering the historical and theological significance of the Nicene Creed, it becomes clear that it represents far more than a technical phrase about divine substance. It symbolizes the effort of the ancient church to preserve the centrality of Christ as fully God and fully worthy of worship. It demonstrates that doctrinal definition arises from the need to protect what is considered essential for salvation. Ultimately, the assertion that the Son is of the same substance as the Father became a pillar of classical Christian theology. Its formulation involved intense debates, but also profound spiritual conviction. The Nicene Creed was not the product of arbitrary imposition, but the fruit of concrete historical reflection, marked by real tensions and a sincere search for unity in truth. Understanding this process broadens our perception of how central doctrines were established. It shows that Christian faith developed through dialogue and the confrontation of ideas within specific contexts, but always guided by the concern to remain faithful to what was understood as divine revelation. The choice of the term homoousios testifies to this effort, a word carefully selected to express a mystery that the Church considered non-negotiable. Here it is clearly seen that doctrinal definition did not arise automatically, nor was it the result of a simple, linear process. It was constructed through collective deliberation, intense dialogue, and confrontation of interpretations in a deeply specific political and religious context. The setting was the Council of Nicaea, held in the 4th century, a moment when Christianity was undergoing a decisive transformation in its position within the Roman Empire. The formulation of the theological definitions established there cannot be understood in isolation from the historical circumstances that shaped them. Until a few decades earlier, Christians had experienced severe persecutions. During the reign of emperors such as Diocletian, communities were dismantled, leaders imprisoned, and sacred texts confiscated. The Christian faith was viewed with suspicion and at times considered a threat to public order. However, with Constantine's rise and the promulgation of the Edict of Milan, the situation changed drastically. Christianity went from a marginalized religion to a tradition officially tolerated and progressively favored by imperial power. This change in context inevitably influenced the dynamics of theological debates. When the Church was persecuted, its internal controversies remained relatively confined to the communal sphere. With imperial support, however, disputes acquired public and political dimensions. Doctrinal divergences ceased to be merely theological matters. They also became potential sources of social instability within a vast and culturally diverse empire. In the context of the Council, the Arian controversy represented a real threat to Christian unity. The central issue concerned the nature of Christ and his relationship with the Father. For some, like Arius, the Son had been created and therefore was not eternal like the Father. For others, this position compromised the very heart of Christian faith, as it diminished the full divinity of Christ. The intensity of the discussion reflected the importance of the topic. It was not a secondary detail, but the understanding of the identity of the one proclaimed as Savior. Doctrinal definition, therefore, required careful formulation. It could not be vague or excessively ambiguous for fear of perpetuating division. At the same time, it needed to express fidelity to apostolic tradition and the Scriptures. This balance was only possible through collective deliberation. Bishops from different regions brought their pastoral experiences, theological traditions, and local concerns. The debate was plural, and the final decision reflected a synthesis effort. However, the pursuit of doctrinal unity was linked not only to theological fidelity, but also to the need for social cohesion. The Roman Empire was vast, composed of multiple peoples, languages, and cultures. Religion played a fundamental role in constructing collective identity. For Constantine, religious division could weaken political stability. Thus, convening the council also had a strategic purpose: to promote consensus that favored imperial peace. This does not mean that the decisions were merely imposed by civil power. The debates were real and, in many moments, intense. Nevertheless, the environment in which they took place was inevitably shaped by the new relationship between church and state. Imperial presence conferred solemnity and urgency to the discussions. There was an awareness that resolving the conflict would have repercussions beyond the strictly ecclesial sphere. The transition from a persecuted church to a church supported by the empire also brought new challenges. Progressive institutionalization demanded greater doctrinal clarity. Communities spread across distant regions needed common references. Conciliar definition provided standardized language that could be taught, proclaimed, and defended. Thus, the creed was not only an expression of faith, it was also an instrument of unification. This unification, however, was neither immediate nor absolute. Even after the council, controversies continued for decades. Different emperors supported different currents, and the reception of conciliar decisions varied from region to region. This demonstrates that doctrinal definition, although formalized at a given historical moment, undergoes a gradual assimilation process. The case of Nicaea reveals that Christian theology developed within concrete history. It did not emerge as an abstract system disconnected from social reality. On the contrary, it was shaped by political, cultural, and pastoral circumstances. The need to preserve the integrity of the faith was intertwined with the concern to maintain the unity of the expanding Christian community. Furthermore, the conciliar experience consolidated a model of conflict resolution that would profoundly mark the Christian tradition. The idea of gathering leaders to deliberate collectively became a recurring practice in the following centuries. The authority of the council did not reside solely in the final decision, but in the process of shared discernment that preceded it. The change in Christianity's status also altered its self-understanding. From a minority and often marginal movement, it came to occupy a central position in the public life of the empire. This new condition required more systematic responses to theological questions. Doctrinal elaboration became an instrument of collective identity, delineating boundaries and defining orthodoxy. However, it is essential to recognize the complexity of this transformation. The rapprochement between church and state brought benefits, such as stability and the possibility of broad organization. At the same time, it raised questions about spiritual autonomy and political influence. Subsequent history would show that this relationship could generate both cooperation and tension. Looking at the context of the council, it becomes clear that doctrinal definition was not the inevitable product of linear evolution. It resulted from decisions made by concrete people in specific circumstances, responding to urgent challenges. Imperial support created conditions for the gathering and implementation of decisions, but the theological content emerged from debate among ecclesiastical leaders. The pursuit of doctrinal unity, therefore, had multiple dimensions. It was an expression of commitment to what was understood as revealed truth. It was also a strategy for communal cohesion. And in a certain sense, it was an instrument of political stability. These elements cannot be rigidly separated. They intertwine in the historical process. In sum, the definition elaborated at Nicaea exemplifies how faith and history move together. Christian doctrine was forged in dialogue with real circumstances, under internal and external pressures. 4th century Christianity was no longer a marginal community. It had become a socially relevant force, capable of influencing and being influenced by imperial power. Recognizing this does not diminish the theological value of conciliar definitions. On the contrary, it allows for a deeper understanding. They testify to a collective effort to preserve the essence of faith amid radical transformations. They show that truth, in the Christian tradition, is not conceived as an isolated abstraction, but as a reality discerned within the historical community. Thus, in affirming that doctrinal definition did not arise automatically, we acknowledge that it was constructed step by step, amid debates, tensions, and negotiations. It resulted from shared discernment within a specific political and religious context. And the shift in scenario, from persecution to imperial support, deeply shaped this dynamic, linking the pursuit of theological fidelity to the need for social cohesion in a vast and diverse empire. However, it is important to understand that Nicaea did not immediately end all controversies. After the council, tensions and divergent interpretations continued. There were periods in which positions close to Arianism regained ground, supported by different leaders and even by later emperors. This demonstrates that the process of doctrinal consolidation was gradual, marked by advances and setbacks. Other subsequent councils deepened and clarified issues related to Christology and the Trinity. The Council of Constantinople reaffirmed and expanded Nicaea's decisions, especially regarding the divinity of the Holy Spirit. Later, the Council of Chalcedon sought to balance affirmations about Christ's full divinity and full humanity, responding to new controversies that arose in the following decades. These gatherings reveal that Christian doctrine was formulated in dialogue with concrete challenges. Definitions did not emerge in the abstract, but in response to specific interpretations that needed evaluation. Each council represented a collective effort of discernment. Although political influences were present, theological debates were real and intense. Bishops and theologians were convinced that the issues at stake touched the heart of the Christian faith. Observing this process, it becomes evident that orthodoxy was shaped over time. It was not a simple arbitrary choice among equivalent opinions, but an attempt to preserve internal coherence and continuity with the apostolic tradition as understood by the prevailing leadership. The formulation of creeds served as a common reference, an instrument of unity, and a teaching standard. At the same time, the existence of such vigorous debates shows that early Christianity was dynamic. There was room for argumentation, reflection, and confrontation of ideas. Unity was not the result of initial uniformity, but of a process of collective maturation. This maturation involved listening, analysis of scripture, appeal to received tradition, and consideration of the pastoral implications of each position. The political context also deserves attention. The relationship between church and empire profoundly altered how controversies were handled. Before the legalization of Christianity, theological divergences were debated on a more limited scale. With imperial support, they became matters of public and political concern. The emperor sought stability. Religious leaders sought doctrinal fidelity. This interaction between political power and religious authority shaped the environment in which decisions were made. Understanding this scenario does not diminish the importance of the councils. On the contrary, it allows them to be appreciated with greater historical realism. They were moments in which faith, culture, and politics intertwined. The definitions that emerged from these gatherings profoundly influenced subsequent Christian theology, shaping liturgies, catechesis, and confessional formulations over the centuries. Furthermore, the councils demonstrate that the Christian tradition has an essential communal dimension. Faith was not defined solely by isolated individuals, but by assemblies seeking consensus. Even when consensus was not unanimous, there was a deliberate effort to formulate expressions representing the majority conviction of the gathered churches. This conciliar dynamic also reveals something about the nature of tradition itself. It is not static but develops in response to new questions. Each generation faces specific challenges and must reinterpret, clarify, and sometimes reformulate its theological language to remain faithful to the core of the faith. The councils of the early centuries established precedents for this process. Considering the Council of Nicaea within this broader panorama, it becomes evident that it marked a turning point, not only for the Christological definition it presented, but for inaugurating a model of ecumenical dispute resolution. It symbolizes the transition from persecuted Christianity to institutionalized Christianity integrated into the empire. Therefore, affirming that doctrinal definition was built through collective deliberation is to recognize the complexity of the historical process. Conciliar decisions were the result of intense reflection, grounded in scripture, tradition, and context. They did not arise automatically, nor were they simply imposed without debate. In the end, the councils played a decisive role in structuring Christianity as an organized and theologically articulated tradition. They show that the Christian faith throughout history sought to preserve its identity amid divergent interpretations. At the same time, they reveal that this identity was shaped in dialogue, conflict, and collective discernment. Understanding this broadens our perception of how central doctrines were formulated and why they continue to exert profound influence today. Later, the Council of Chalcedon deepened Christological reflection, affirming the doctrine of Christ's two natures, divine and human, without confusion, without change, without division, and without separation. These formulations sought to preserve a delicate balance in the face of divergent interpretations circulating in the communities. The necessity of such definitions demonstrates that multiple competing readings existed on central themes. However, while these decisions shaped what would become the predominant doctrine, other currents continued to exist, some on the margins, others gradually considered heterodox. Texts associated with Gnostic traditions, for example, offered different interpretations of creation, redemption, and spiritual knowledge. The discovery of the Nag Hammadi library in the 20th century evidenced that these voices were not merely caricatures presented by opponents, but real expressions of communities with their own identity. Recognizing this diversity does not imply relativizing everything or claiming that there were no criteria informing the Christian tradition. On the contrary, it shows that there was a process. The predominance of certain currents resulted from theological, pastoral, missionary, and even political factors. More structured communities with organized leadership and extensive communication networks had a greater capacity to preserve and transmit their teachings. Furthermore, the definition of the New Testament canon was gradual. Books such as the Four Gospels, the Pauline letters, and other writings gained broad recognition over time, not solely by the isolated decision of a council, but through continuous liturgical use and community acceptance. At the same time, other texts circulated and were read in certain regions but did not achieve the same universal reception. This panorama reveals that Christianity was structured through historical discernment. It was neither an instant process nor entirely uniform. There were tensions, debates, and adjustments. By analyzing this development, we better understand how the tradition consolidated. Historical Christianity is the result of centuries of reflection, prayer, controversy, and collective maturation. The existence of alternative voices broadens our perception of this dynamic. They serve as testimony that the first Christian generations were deeply engaged in interpreting the experience of Christ. Each group sought to answer the great questions. Who is Jesus? What does his death and resurrection mean? How should one live in light of his message? The answers were not identical everywhere, but they shared the centrality of Christ's figure. Understanding this also helps avoid modern simplifications. Sometimes there is a temptation to imagine that history was merely a clash between truth and error, clearly defined from the start. Reality was more complex. There was sincere seeking, but also disputes over authority and influence. There were deep convictions, but also cultural contexts that shaped interpretations. This historical awareness can strengthen, not weaken, faith. It shows that central doctrines did not emerge by chance, but were developed to respond to concrete challenges. At the same time, it reminds us that tradition is the fruit of a path traveled, not an arbitrary imposition. Knowing this can generate greater appreciation for the theological depth developed over the centuries. On the other hand, recognizing that other voices left written records invites humility. The predominant tradition does not exist in isolation. It dialogued, confronted, and defined itself in relation to alternatives. Ignoring these alternatives impoverishes historical understanding. Studying them, in turn, does not mean adopting them, but understanding the scenario in which orthodoxy was formulated. This balance is essential. Initial diversity does not imply that all positions were equivalent in theological coherence or historical consistency. Some currents lost strength because they failed to maintain internal unity or broad community acceptance. Others fragmented or remained restricted to specific groups. The predominance of certain interpretations was accompanied by institutional continuity and missionary expansion. Reflecting on this process, it becomes evident that Christianity was structured both by spiritual conviction and historical organization. Faith took root in concrete communities, with defined leadership and consistent liturgical practice. This contributed to its preservation over the centuries. However, the reminder that there was initial plurality prevents overly rigid views of history. It shows that doctrinal development responded to living contexts. It also shows that the pursuit of understanding has always been part of the Christian experience. The major conciliar definitions did not close all questions. They established milestones from which new reflections continued to emerge. Thus, stating that not all interpretations carried the same historical weight is to acknowledge the reality of the consolidation process. And admitting that other voices existed is to accept that history is richer than linear narratives suggest. Christianity was not formed in uniform silence but in intense dialogue. This broader perspective allows one to understand the tradition with maturity. Rather than seeing it as a monolithic block from the beginning, we can view it as a tree that grew, faced storms, strengthened its roots, and expanded its branches. Some branches flourished and endured, others withered over time, but all were part of the initial ecosystem. In the end, the structuring of Christianity was the result of collective discernment, communal experience, and continuous theological reflection. The existence of multiple voices in the early centuries does not diminish the importance of the definitions that prevailed. On the contrary, it highlights the path traveled until these definitions were recognized as central. Understanding this historical journey broadens our capacity to evaluate with awareness and depth the legacy that has reached us. Today, these manuscripts are available for public study, translated into various languages, and analyzed by researchers worldwide. Universities, seminaries, and independent scholars have access to the content, and anyone interested can consult printed or digital editions. This democratized access represents a significant change compared to earlier periods, when such documents remained restricted to a few specialists. The possibility of directly examining the content allows each person to form their own conclusions. It is no longer necessary to rely exclusively on summaries or indirect critiques. The reader can confront the text, observe its language, symbols, and theological proposals. This direct contact encourages a more critical and responsible approach. At the same time, it requires maturity. Not every ancient text should be interpreted literally or out of context. It is essential to consider the cultural environment, philosophical influences, and historical circumstances in which it was produced. Moreover, the rediscovery of Nag Hammadi encourages broader reflection on how religious traditions develop. No tradition emerges fully formed. It develops over time in dialogue with different cultures, facing internal and external challenges. Recognizing this historical dynamic does not diminish the importance of faith. On the contrary, it can strengthen it by making it more conscious of its own roots. For many scholars, the greatest legacy of this discovery lies not in replacing one narrative with another, but in enriching the panorama. Early Christianity comes to be seen as a field of vibrant debates, where fundamental questions were being formulated. Who is Jesus? What is the nature of his mission? What does it mean to be saved? What is the relationship between spirit and matter? These questions remain relevant today. There is also potential spiritual impact in this rediscovery. By realizing that the early centuries were marked by intense inquiry and plurality of interpretations, the contemporary reader may feel encouraged to examine their own faith more deeply. The existence of different historical currents does not compel anyone to abandon their convictions, but can invite a more mature and nuanced understanding of the tradition. It is important, however, to avoid extremes. On one hand, one should not ignore these texts as if they were irrelevant. On the other, it is not prudent to romanticize them as representing a lost truth suppressed conspiratorially. History is rarely so simple. The formation of the Christian canon involved theological, pastoral, and historical criteria debated over generations. The Nag Hammadi texts are part of this broader context, but do not exhaust it. By allowing each person to examine the content directly and form their own conclusions, the contemporary era places responsibility in the hands of the reader. The information is available. Discernment must accompany it. Reading these manuscripts can be enriching, provided it is accompanied by careful study and comparison with other historical sources. Ultimately, the rediscovery of the Nag Hammadi texts does not destroy the history of Christianity. It makes it more complex and interesting. It shows that faith developed amid debates, interpretations, and sincere inquiries. It shows that early Christianity was a living, dynamic, and plural movement in its first centuries. Above all, it demonstrates that historical study remains a valuable tool for understanding how religious traditions were formed and consolidated. Thus, the expansion of academic understanding should not be seen as a threat, but as an opportunity. Access to the manuscripts allows dialogue, investigation, and reflection. It allows each individual, with responsibility and maturity, to examine the sources, consider the context, and build a more conscious understanding of their own spiritual and intellectual journey. In essence, this tradition maintains that liberation begins with vision, not in the physical sense, but in the sense of awareness. When the individual observes their thoughts, questions inherited beliefs, and seeks inner understanding, they reduce the influence of unconscious mechanisms that shape their life. The final message of these texts echoes an ancient exhortation. Those who have ears to hear, let them hear. Those who have eyes to see, let them see. More than accepting extraordinary claims, the invitation is to investigate, study the sources, reflect critically, and cultivate discernment. Thus, the debate about the Archons can be understood in two ways: as a literal description of spiritual forces, or as symbolic language for psychological and social structures that influence human consciousness. In both cases, the central call remains the same: to develop lucidity, inner responsibility, and spiritual freedom. Ultimately, the issue is not simply to believe or reject, but to understand. Between blind faith and hasty denial lies a vast and fertile territory called discernment. It is here that spiritual maturity begins to take shape. Throughout history, many have taken extreme positions. Some accepted traditions unquestioningly, others discarded them without investigation. However, understanding requires more than reaction. It demands inner disposition, intellectual humility, and spiritual courage. It requires the ability to look at sources, facts, contexts, and, at the same time, one's own heart. Access to ancient manuscripts significantly broadens our perception of Christian history and its multiple currents. For centuries, much of these documents were restricted to specific circles, preserved in libraries, monasteries, or academic archives. Today, however, with translations, comparative studies, and technological advances, it has become possible for any sincere seeker to engage with texts that shaped theological debates, doctrinal conflicts, and spiritual understandings over the centuries. This access should not be seen as a threat to faith, but as an opportunity for deepening it. Understanding Christian history does not mean weakening belief, but strengthening it through awareness. When we examine ancient manuscripts, we realize that Christianity did not emerge in a cultural vacuum. It flourished amidst Jewish, Greco-Roman, and Eastern influences. There were dialogues, tensions, disputes, and councils that helped define what many today consider orthodoxy. This historical process shows that faith, although grounded in divine revelation, is also expressed within human reality, with its limitations, conflicts, and interpretations. Considering the historical context, it becomes possible to understand why certain ideas were accepted while others were rejected. Some currents emphasized Christ's humanity, others his divinity. Some valued inner knowledge, others communal structure and institutional authority. This plural scenario shows that the search to understand Jesus' message was always accompanied by profound questions about identity, salvation, grace, and truth. Ignoring this complexity oversimplifies a process that was, in reality, deeply rich and challenging. However, understanding is not just an intellectual exercise. There is also a spiritual dimension in this process. The sincere seeker does not approach ancient manuscripts merely as one analyzing a historical document, but as one seeking meaning. There is a difference between academic curiosity and spiritual hunger. The first seeks information, the second seeks transformation. And this is where the journey becomes personal. Each individual must decide what to do with what they discover. Examining the sources requires responsibility. It is not enough to read isolated fragments or superficial interpretations. One must consider authorship, dating, cultural context, and theological intention. Many misconceptions arise when texts are removed from their original environment and reinterpreted through modern expectations. True understanding requires patience. It requires willingness to deal with ambiguities, historical silences, and disagreements among scholars. It also requires the humility to admit that not all questions will have definitive answers. At the same time, this journey can strengthen faith in surprising ways. When we realize that the central message of Christianity has traversed centuries, persecutions, disputes, and cultural transformations, we understand that there is something deeply resilient in its essence. The figure of Jesus remains the central point, regardless of interpretative variations around him. His call to love, repentance, mercy, and inner transformation echoes through recognized manuscripts and even through those that remained on the margins of official tradition. It is up to each seeker to examine the sources and decide what significance these traditions hold for their own spiritual journey. This decision should not be made hastily or out of fear. Authentic faith does not fear investigation. On the contrary, it grows when confronted with honest questions. Doubt, when sincere, is not the enemy of faith. It can be an instrument of purification, removing superficial beliefs and leading to deeper, more conscious convictions. There is also an element of personal responsibility in this choice. One cannot completely outsource their own spiritual understanding. Religious leaders, teachers, and scholars can guide, but the final decision regarding the meaning of traditions belongs to the individual before God. This responsibility may seem heavy, but it is also liberating. It places the seeker in an active, not passive position. Instead of simply inheriting a faith, they consciously build it, engaging with history, scripture, and their own spiritual experience. It is important to remember that tradition does not mean stagnation. Over the centuries, Christianity has undergone reforms, revivals, and rediscoveries. New perspectives arose as cultural contexts challenged old interpretations. This does not mean that truth constantly changes, but that human understanding of it progressively deepens. In this sense, ancient manuscripts serve as windows into this continuous process of reflection and maturation. On the other hand, care must be taken so that the pursuit of knowledge does not become intellectual vanity. The ultimate goal is not to accumulate information, but to grow in wisdom. There is a difference between knowing about God and knowing God. The first can be acquired through books. The second involves relationship, prayer, and inner transformation. Historical study should lead to reverence, not arrogance. It should expand admiration for the complexity of faith's history while deepening the simplicity of trust in God. The spiritual journey is unique for each person. What is a challenge to faith for some is confirmation for others. What generates questions for some strengthens existing convictions for others. Therefore, comparing paths can be unfair. Each seeker travels their own way, guided by experiences, readings, and spiritual life. The important thing is that this path is walked with sincerity and openness. Ultimately, understanding is an act of courage. It is easier to accept without questioning or to reject without investigation. Understanding requires navigating the tension between faith and reason, tradition and discovery, certainty and mystery. It requires acknowledging that Christian history is vast, complex, and at the same time deeply marked by a central message of hope and redemption. When the seeker allows themselves to immerse in this process with balance, they discover something transformative. Faith is not weakened by honest investigation, but refined by it. The fear of questioning usually stems from insecure understanding, built more on inherited habits than on matured convictions. However, when the search is conducted with reverence and sincerity, the result is not the destruction of faith, but its purification. Understanding broadens horizons, strengthens conscious convictions, and eliminates superficial illusions that once seemed solid only because they were never examined. This immersion requires courage. It requires willingness to leave the comfort zone of ready answers and enter the territory of deep questions. Often we were taught that questioning is synonymous with doubting, and doubting would be a sign of spiritual weakness. Yet the history of faith shows that great spiritual advances were born from sincere questions. Honest investigation is not rebellion against God, it is a desire to know Him more truly. When faith is tested through study, reflection, and experience, it becomes more conscious, less dependent on external pressures, and more rooted in inner conviction. At the end of this journey, the decision about the meaning of traditions will not be based solely on cultural inheritance or external influence, but on mature reflection and personal experience. And this makes all the difference. Inherited faith may be comfortable, but consciously built faith is resilient. It withstands criticism, momentary doubts, and personal crises, because it is not supported merely by external authority, but by internal understanding. The seeker comes to know not only what they believe, but why they believe. In this process, tradition ceases to be a burden and becomes a bridge. It connects generations, preserves teachings, and offers wisdom accumulated over centuries. However, tradition does not mean mechanical repetition. It means dialogue between past and present. When one examines the historical roots of Christian faith, they realize that it has crossed empires, persecutions, councils, reforms, and spiritual renewals. Even amidst divergences, the essence of the message has remained: the centrality of Christ, the call to repentance, the practice of love, and the hope of redemption. Understanding this brings balance. Not everything ancient is automatically sacred, and not everything new is automatically dangerous. Discernment arises when we learn to distinguish between essence and form, core and periphery. Many historical discussions involved specific interpretations, languages, and contexts. Knowing these contexts does not weaken faith. It helps separate what is eternal from what is cultural. Thus, the issue is no longer simply to believe or reject. It becomes an invitation to depth, a call to spiritual responsibility, a challenge to go beyond ready-made answers and seek true understanding. This call is not only intellectual, it is existential. It involves mind and heart. It involves study and prayer. It involves reading and silence. The seeker discovers that true spiritual maturity arises from integrating knowledge and devotion. There is also an inner dimension in this process that cannot be ignored. When investigating, the individual is confronted with their own motivations. They need to ask themselves whether they are seeking to confirm biases or genuinely discover truth. Honesty with oneself is an essential part of the journey. Without it, any study can become merely a tool to justify previously chosen conclusions. Authentic investigation, however, is willing to be transformed by what it encounters. On this path, faith ceases to depend on fear. Many remain bound to beliefs out of fear of questioning and losing everything they consider secure. But faith, born of fear, is fragile. It avoids questions because it fears answers. Faith, born of understanding, does not shy away from investigation. It faces doubts as opportunities for growth, and even when it finds no complete answers, it learns to live with mystery without losing trust. Mystery, moreover, is an inevitable part of spiritual experience. To understand does not mean to eliminate all the unknown. It means acknowledging the limits of human reason and yet continuing to seek. Spiritual maturity does not require answers to everything. It requires humility to accept that some realities transcend our capacity for explanation. This humility does not weaken faith, it makes it more reverent. Throughout the journey, the seeker realizes that historical and theological investigation does not replace personal experience with God. On the contrary, it can deepen it. When the mind better understands the foundations of faith, the heart prays with greater awareness. When convictions are examined, they become stronger. Reading ancient texts, studying traditions, and analyzing contexts do not necessarily distance one from spirituality. They can bring one closer, provided it is done with balance. There is also a practical fruit of this maturity: tolerance. Those who understand the complexity of Christian history tend to be less arrogant in their own certainties. They realize that over centuries, sincere men and women diverged on many points, seeking to honor God as best they could. This realization generates humility, and humility generates compassion. Mature faith does not need to impose itself aggressively. It sustains itself with serenity. More than finding historical answers, the seeker can find something even more valuable: inner clarity. This clarity is not the absence of questions, but the alignment between mind and heart. It is the sense that chosen faith makes sense not only culturally, but existentially. It is the awareness that the journey was not driven by external pressure, but by internal conviction. Beyond clarity, spiritual maturity emerges. This maturity manifests in attitudes. It reveals itself in how a person deals with criticism, crises, and differences. Mature faith does not panic in the face of questioning. It listens, evaluates, and responds with balance. It does not need to attack to defend itself. Its strength lies in the depth of its roots, and perhaps most importantly, a faith emerges that does not depend on fear, but on understanding. It does not rely on the threat of punishment, but on awareness of grace. It does not rely on social pressure, but on personal conviction. This faith is free. It remains even when circumstances change. It remains when opinions around it shift. It remains because it was built through reflection, prayer, and experience. Ultimately, the call to understanding is also a call to transformation. It is not only about accumulating knowledge about traditions, but allowing that knowledge to shape character. True spiritual investigation leads to practicing love, seeking truth, and living mercy. If study does not result in inner change, it remains incomplete. Therefore, the call is not for superficial faith nor impulsive rejection. It is for a conscious journey, a walk that involves an attentive mind and an open heart, a willingness to learn from the past without becoming its prisoner, courage to ask questions without abandoning reverence. When the seeker accepts this invitation, they discover that understanding does not steal faith. It deepens it. It does not weaken it. It strengthens it. It does not fragment it. It purifies it. And at the end of the path, they realize that their belief is not just inheritance, nor just tradition, nor just habit. It is choice. It is conviction. It is relationship. And this faith, built on understanding, becomes not just an idea to defend, but a life to live.